Hi, everybody who's joining us from all around Australia. I'll just give it just another minute so we can all come in. That would be absolutely lovely. I hope you're having a good morning so far. We're in a few different time zones for this ACEN Critical Conversations. If you're in Western Australia, it's a very good morning for you. It's 8 a.m. and you've probably just had some brekkie. Or perhaps you're sitting down with us over some tea and toast. That would also be lovely. If you're in Queensland, it's 10 a.m. So you probably have your cup of coffee with you. And for those in New South Wales, it's 11 a.m. So hello to you. A big warm welcome. All right. I might kick off. Before I start, I'd like to just let you know that this is being recorded and the presentation today will also be recorded and circulated to all registrants afterwards. So if you are uncomfortable with sharing your video, please keep your video off. Just in this initial introduction, you're welcome to leave it on or off at the moment. And then when we go into the breakout rooms, you can turn it on. But let me start with an acknowledgement of country. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands. Here I am sitting in Wollongong, which is Dharawal country. And I've been learning quite a lot about the stories and the generations of stories from Indigenous elders that are passed on through the generations. And I'm learning about in Indigenous cultures about the notion of relationships and reciprocity and how that is also facilitated through storytelling. So I'd like to acknowledge Indigenous elders past, present and emerging, and I'd like to acknowledge all the countries that we're sitting on here today and the ancestral lands as well, from which today we'll be learning from and from what we are grounded in. So I'd like to show my respect and appreciation. And to continue to share our stories as well, we are here in the ACEN Critical Conversations, which is also a platform for storytelling and sharing of experiences. So my name is Dr. Bonnie Dean. I'm from the University of Wollongong and I sit on the ACEN Board of Directors. And it's such a pleasure to have you here today. Thanks so much for taking time out to join us to have a chat about WIL and to have a chat about, particularly today, about quality WIL and the quality WIL framework. So some initial housekeeping. We will be recording the presentation for those of you who have just joined us, and the presentation will be circulated afterwards to all of those who are registered, and it will also be placed on the website. We're going to hear from our presenters today, and that will go for approximately sort of 15 minutes. Then we'll be going into breakout rooms, and this is where we can enable our storytelling, where we're really asking you to participate. We want you to talk. We want you to turn your screens on at that point and unmute yourself so we can hear and learn from one another and within those small groups. And then after that, we'll be brought back into the main room where we will share some insights on what happened to each of those rooms. Now, those small groups will be facilitated. We'll have facilitators in each of those rooms. And our facilitators today are representatives on ACEN chapters and the Board of Directors. So let me introduce you right now to our facilitators. So if you don't mind giving us a bit of a wave when I say your name, that would be lovely. So we have Beate Mueller from UTS. Hello and welcome to you, Beate. Michael O'Connor from Western Sydney. Annette Marlowe from University of Tasmania. Narelle Patton from Charles State University, Julia Caldecott from Southern Cross University, and Michelle Eadie from UAW. Thanks so much to our facilitators. So you will be seeing one of their lovely faces inside those breakout rooms in just a moment. But let's get into the good stuff. Today, we're going to talk about quality WIL. We're going to look at a framework that was developed through ACEN, and that is available on the ACEN website. And it has been sent to you, a report has been sent to you via a link previously. Our two presenters today are Matthew Campbell from Torrens University and Leonie Russell from RMIT University. And now both Leonie and Matthew are authors of this report, and it's our pleasure to have you along today so you can share some insights, provide a bit of an overview and some future directions as well. Share with us what's happening in terms of quality WIL. So what I'll do now is while they're doing their presentation, let's all turn our videos off and then we can open them up again once we're in those rooms. I'd love to hand over to you now, Leonie and Matthew. Thanks so much.
Yeah, good morning. And welcome everybody, and good morning, Leonie, and an acknowledgement also to everybody that's joining from right across the country and beyond. And I'm joining you from Brisbane on Yaga and Turrbal lands, and acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which I'm presenting from. It's a great opportunity to start this morning to talk about quality in work integrated learning, as we sort of see an ongoing maturation of practice and pedagogy in this space. And in commencing our conversation today, I think Leonie and I want to take the time to acknowledge that the ideas that we're presenting on are drawn from research which we've participated and led in recent times, and in particular acknowledge our colleagues who supported the development of the WIL Quality Assurance Framework. Lorraine and Lindy, Ricky, Kate, thank you. I was going blank there, and Maria. And also the contribution of our Canadian colleagues, in particular Judine Pretty, who has continually challenged our understandings of quality and how these can be extended, not just from Australia, but into global context. And we'll talk a little bit about that later as well. Our conversation today aims to sort of follow three key areas. Firstly, we want to have a discussion around what quality and quality assurance in WIL looks like. Secondly, a review of some frameworks which can inform this discussion. And then finally, extending from the theoretical to the pragmatic and talking about the application of quality frameworks to inform pedagogies and practices. So as this is a conversation, not just a presentation, what we hope to do is to contribute to sparking some discussion around three key foci. Firstly, the relationship between context and quality. Secondly, a deeper exploration and critiques of some of the frameworks that are there and how they might apply in your particular situations. And then extending consideration of these discussions to how understandings of quality can start to shape practices and pedagogies, particularly in the WIL environment. And these three questions that are on screen, we plan to use these sort of to shape the conversation today. And these will sort of hopefully form the basis of the conversations we have in small groups and then later on. So quality, and that which is valued as quality, is heavily dependent on context. It's not possible today to provide an in-depth exploration of the literature around quality, but it would be remiss to not acknowledge that any discussion of quality in higher education is located within an extensive body of literature, including a range of research undertaken on quality and work experiences, such as that by Lee Harvey and Graham Gibbs, etc. However, despite this extensive research, there still lacks a common definition of what constitutes quality in higher education, and largely due to concepts of quality being contextually dependent. At its core, we would contest that quality and what's valued in higher education is shaped by the expectations of various stakeholders, including government, industry, students, staff, etc. And in making statements of quality, universities are really attempting to articulate that which they value in their approaches to teaching and learning, student support, industry engagement, etc. The articulations of quality really set benchmarks for which the institution is able to work towards and drive transformation in practice and purpose. And depending on the perspective of the purpose of higher education, success of these transformations could be considered in the capacity of the university to differentiate itself in the marketplace, attract more students, ensure long-term economic success, or maybe measures of the contribution of the university to advancing wider society and social goals. So conception of quality, though embedded in local contexts, are not isolated from a wider globalisation of higher education, with some organisations, for example, such as the AACSB in the business space, pushing a quality agenda and practices which transcend the nation state. Within the WIL context, though, alongside lacking clarity of quality in higher education, we also lack a precision on the parameters and attributes which constitute successful WIL. Whilst we have some emerging shared understandings of WIL, we still lack consistency. And a simpler exploration of university websites highlights the plethora of definitions of what's considered to be WIL, the range of measures of success, and the intentions for the role of WIL in supporting higher education. And this has largely led to quality standards advanced in higher education, often neglecting WIL in these conversations. So the challenge in defining WIL is because, and are generally accepted, that it's a complex interconnection of a variety of elements. WIL, unlike most other teaching and learning in higher education, is a partnership across two complex settings, the university and the workplace, both of which have highly contested boundaries and experiences. Further, WIL intersects with multiple practices and space in higher education. It goes between teaching and learning, administration, industry engagement, student support, etc. Therefore, it becomes challenging to provide a simplistic definition of what may be considered quality will. Instead, it is argued that any framework or model of quality must present an appreciation of the complexity of will practice and pedagogies across multiple domains of higher education. So recent work, and this is a lovely blurry slide, but there's a lovely hyperlink at the bottom which you can access this on. But recent work we've undertaken in the Australian context has developed a framework for quality across 4 domains of practice: student experience, curriculum design, institutional requirements, and stakeholder engagement. And this framework has considered practices before, during, and after the WIL experience across these 4 domains. And please use the hyperlink to find more information about this framework, and you can read in more depth. But in developing the framework, it was noted that a limitation was that it was solely grounded within the Australian context. And there was a gap in knowing how this would be translated to the globalised nature of higher education policy and practice. If we turn our gaze a little bit towards our Canadian colleagues, they have a very different experience of WIL, which is often influenced by widespread models of cooperative education, direct government funding, etc. Some of which I think may come to bear in the Australian context, particularly the advent of the NPIL funding models. In the context, quality assurance in the Canadian context is manifested in accreditation processes through the equivalent of ACEN, CE WIL, Canadian WIL, and the application of what has been described as the AAA plus quality framework. In this framing, the 3 A's represent aims, actions, and achievements, with each considered from the perspective of different stakeholders. Again, there's a link there. By all means, please go and have a look at that framework a little bit more depth. But what we wanted to try and suggest is that in advancing an argument for a globalised framework for WIL quality, there may be merit in considering an overlap between the Canadian and the Australian models, in which the various aims and desired achievements or outcomes of the different stakeholders are considered through the lenses of the 4 domains of practice. That is, whilst the Australian model speaks of the student experience, that's not exclusively the domain of students. Instead, each stakeholder has an interest, the purpose, of value within that domain. And there will be a little bit more on this model, shameless self-promotion here, in an upcoming book chapter in the WIL handbook that hopefully will be out towards the end of the latter part of this year, early next year. But having proposed this model of quality and WIL, it's still acknowledged that it remains a contested space. And the realisation of any model of quality must be considered through the experiences, opportunities, and limitations of particular local contexts. A model of the like proposed provides a starting point for the development of a more thorough definition of WIL pedagogy and practice. And the model offers a frame and a common language that could be used to develop quality standards applicable to multiple forms of WIL in national and regional contexts. And models and frameworks like this generally tend to provide opportunities for us to have conversations to better create and develop WIL experiences and programs based on the aims of stakeholders and key design criteria. It allows us to benchmark the quality of our WIL experiences and programs, identifying opportunities for continuous improvement, and finally allows us to examine and understand the differences in the types of WIL and in the similarities and differences across various regions of the world, but also within our national context. But critical to the success of any quality framework is its application of transforming practice and pedagogy. And so therefore, I'll now hand over to Leonie to actually take us into a bit of an exploration of the practical application of quality frameworks in Australian universities. So Leonie.
Great, thanks Matthew. Okay, next slide. I think I was very lucky, very fortunate earlier in the year to be involved in some global online modules around quality, and the majority of the people in that group were from Canada. There was a few Americans, a few Australians, but it was good to hear them talk about, the Canadians talk about how they're using their framework. So I've pulled together a bit of a list of the various ways in which I'm hearing people actually using the frameworks, either the Canadian or ours, or just looking across both of them. And one of the most common responses from people is that they're using the framework to start a conversation and start to reflect and challenge the status quo of WIL across their institution. And as Matthew mentioned, it's an opportunity for these institutions to have an opportunity to build a shared language around WIL. So I'm sure plenty of your institutions are like RMIT. We are huge, and every college and every school has a different conversation and a different language. So pulling people together to at first get to a point of what are we all talking about. Some institutions are using the framework, the Australian one, to benchmark their WIL practices across courses and programs. So they can have a look about how they're designing and how they're evaluating their WIL and what is quality. I think that, as Matthew said, one of the first conversations is having that conversation around what is quality, what does it look like, what are we trying to get to. The other key thing is around the framework being used to assist in the identification of accountability. So I know at RMIT, we've used the framework to start to work on a RACI. So when you look at the institutional requirements, University of Wollongong, they have an accountability chain. So starting to work out across your institution who's responsible for doing what, how are we even gathering our evidence of our practice? That's always a challenge when you start to look for evidence. And by using the standards as a framework, a holistic view across the university, you can start to identify where are the gaps and where are our opportunities that we can improve our practice. So that's been good. At the more micro level, I know many of the standards are being used to actually review what is the student experience for WIL and what's going on, and starting to tick boxes, create checklists, and have a look at what is actually going at that very micro level, which has been great. I know at RMIT and many other institutions, they're using the framework to help inform the development of professional development activities and resources. We've used it to inform our promotion criteria, things like that. So there's a lot of uses in the HR space as well. Position descriptions, some of the standards are starting to inform this is the key things that we want people to do. How can we build that in to the sort of people that we're hiring in the PD that we're offering? I think one of the key things at the broader scale is that the framework's also being used to inform WIL leadership and to have a look at the governance, for example, designing WIL policies and procedures at an institution-wide level. And definitely it's being used to help look at risk mitigation processes. And we all know that risk management and mitigation is a significant component of all of our WIL activities. There is a key section and standards in the framework about IT systems, data collection, and how we're reporting on our WIL. And for those of you who may have been involved in the recent National Priorities and Industry Linkage Fund process of getting our submissions into the Department of Education, where there's a key component about WIL metrics, we have all started to scramble around about whether we're all using in place or what IT systems do we have in place so that we can actually gather the data and report on the WIL activities that we're doing in our institutions. Another use of the framework is that people are sitting back and having a look at their industry engagement processes and how are they consistently, what sort of approaches they're taking to engage with our industry and community partners. And I mean, there's many, many uses for the framework, so I've tried not to do absolutely everything because it'll be great for you to have that discussion in your groups about how else you could use it or how you are using the framework. But the final one, I think predominantly, I know for us, is looking at how are we gathering feedback, what feedback process are we using from all stakeholders, staff, students and industry to inform continuous improvement on all of our WIL practices. So that's just a few ideas. Who knew the framework could make us all do so much work? Which has moved along. I think, and coming back to what Matthew's talked about, Erin, in regards to the broader aspect of quality in higher education, I think we also need to look at what is expected of us across the tertiary sector. So I'm sure many of you are very aware of the Tertiary Education Quality Standards Agency, and they have a WIL guidance note, which came out in 2017. Our understanding is that WIL guidance note is currently under review. So we keep our eyes out for a new one. They do have this quality framework. and they are using that to help inform the next version of the WIL guidance note. As I mentioned, the NPILF, which is block grants that have come out of the Ready package from the government, there's a requirement that institutions need to be reporting against a range of WIL metrics. And what I mean by categories, we'll get to the point that they want to know how many placements, how many industry engaged projects, whether your students are doing WIL in simulated workplace environments. And there's also a requirement to look at case studies, which are essentially 3-year pilot projects around work integrated learning. So coming back to the need for us all to have some data will impact how we all address the NPILF. Now, for those of you in dual sector universities or from the VE sector, the Australian Skills Quality Authority also has requirements around expectations for work integrated learning, and their training packages set out significant guidelines for how WIL and simulations happen, how assessment happens around WIL. So there is an overarching, much broader picture of how WIL fits in with these expectations around quality in learning and teaching for the tertiary sector. Next one. I'm mindful I'm going over time. Sorry, Bonnie. I'll get yelled at. So I suppose some of the key challenges and considerations for us all is to, and I'm sure you'll talk about this in your groups, is around how we use the framework, what we need to think about. We know that with our domains and our standards, you can look at the framework and use it in a way that is quite granular, or you can look at it holistically. The preferred approach would be to have a holistic approach to looking how WIL is being managed within your universities and what quality looks like in those spaces. So it gives you an opportunity to review it. For many of us, it's about tying in the standards and the framework into our standard review, annual comprehensive program reviews and things like that. And it's also around when you align it to your external accreditation. I know there are many universities going through re-registration through TEXA at the moment, and this also provides an opportunity to use the framework to help you do that review. And one of the key things for all institutions, I'm sure you're aware, it's important to have not just a WIL champion, lots of WIL champions to help do your review and consider what quality looks like. That's it from me.
Thanks, Leonie. Yeah, so where we got to is, so I'll drop into the chat for people's benefit if once I can work out how to do that. The link to the WIL quality framework, which is available for people to have a look at, and we've worked on the assumption that you have explored that already. But in your small groups, what we'll try and invite you to do is to have a look at these 3 core questions. So we haven't spent the time going through the framework in depth, but these 3 questions around how your context informs how you understand quality in WIL practice and pedagogy, the challenges that you see in utilising the framework, but also the opportunities that frameworks allow us around providing some parameters and attributes to the nature of what WIL is. And then lastly, how you actually see the framework being utilised in your context to assure quality of WIL. So Bonnie, did you want to now segment and break people up, and I'll post that link in for everybody.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Matthew and Leonie, for that wonderful overview of quality and work integrated learning. Okay, you will find now on your screen that the rooms have been opened. We're going to have about 15 minutes in those screens in those rooms for conversation. So please go enjoy and share your thoughts on quality WIL.